Over 1.5 million African Americans served during World War I and World War II.
And not one of them would receive our nation's highest honor until decades later, including a man from New York. Fast One's Christina Chiarelli has that story.
Sergeant Henry Johnson was one of thousands of African Americans serving in World War I. The Albany native was recommended for a Medal of Honor, but would never see it. He died in 1929 from 21 combat-related injuries, jobless and homeless.
There was segregation, and we know that segregation then leads to injustice, racism, and that's what we've uncovered here. And that's why now we're setting the record straight.
In 1986, Joe DioGuardi, a former New York congressman, began fighting to get Black American war heroes the recognition they deserve, gathering information on Johnson that would be passed on to the Senate. These 2 volumes were submitted by Senator Chuck Schumer to the Army in 2011. Hundreds of pages making a case for Johnson and why he deserved the Medal of Honor. Earlier this month, Johnson finally received our nation's highest military honor posthumously, almost 100 years later.
Henry was one of the first Americans to receive France's highest award for valor. But his own nation didn't award him anything.
I think people are going to see this as an important case to make for many more Black American soldiers, so that we can finally say we've erased this egregious stain of racial injustice.
9 Black soldiers from around the country serving in both world wars have at last been given the medal, but DioGuardi says many more African Americans deserve the medal, and his work is far from over. In Austin, Christina Chiarelli, FiOS 1 News.
Surrounded by veterans, Mount Vernon Mayor Ernie Davis and former Westchester Congressman Joe DioGuardi unveiling a new plaque to honor World War I African American soldier Sergeant Henry Johnson, a war hero who was denied the nation's highest honor, the Medal of Honor, because of his color. Out of the 1.5 million African Americans who served in World War I and World War II, not one of them was ever given the Medal of Honor. And that's a statistic that Joe DioGuardi just couldn't ignore.
Stereotyping doesn't work for anybody. It's unjust. And no matter what your ethnic or racial or you name it, I think America deserves better.
Since 1986, DioGuardi has taken on the military to posthumously deliver the Medal of Honor to those who have been denied for decades. He was made aware of the issue in 1986 by Dr. Leroy Ramsey, whose son was here to see his father's dream come true.
To see justice prevail after all of these decades, I cannot come up with the words to explain how good that makes me feel.
And veterans agree.
Unfortunately, it took that much time to get it, but it's finally being done. You know, justice is finally being served.
Soldiers who battled for our freedom now being recognized for their service and not by the color of their skin. In Mount Vernon, Tim Cassidy, News 12.
And I'm so glad, being in politics, that there exists a person in the ilk of Joe DioGuardi. And not only has he championed a cause, he did not give up. And in the darkest hours, I know he must have thought, how long will it take? But as they say in church, how long? Not long. And he deserves our gratitude. He deserves our standing ovation for this person, the congressman, coming here to exalt the proposition that all men are created equal. So please, let's rise to our feet for our Congressman Joe DioGuardi.
Mayor, you know, looking back, that was 1986 when Dr. Leroy Ramsey, your dad, Julia, and your dad, David, came to visit me in my office. And I knew he was connected to Mount Vernon. He knew I was the congressman representing Mount Vernon. And he said to me, he says, Joe, I've been working several years on this. I'm a black historian, African-American historian, and I'm concentrating now on correcting racial injustice in the military. And he said to me, did you know, well, first of all, I had Mayor Mario Cuomo send a letter to every one of the Congress people in our state. Now, back then we had 34. Ruth, we're down to 27 now. We're losing a little voice in Washington. We're not growing as fast as the rest of the country. That's the problem. In any case, he came to tell me that I was the only one to answer that letter. And I said, and he gave it to me. And I said, well, I'm honored to hear that, but tell me, why is it that you came to visit me, and what do you think I can do? He says, well, do you know that 1,550,000 African Americans served in World War I and World War II, and not one got our nation's highest military award, honor, which is called the Medal of Honor. In fact, many people know of it as the Congressional Medal of Honor. It's really the Medal of Honor. I said, well, you know, I didn't understand how that could happen. I'm a CPA, and those numbers just don't add up. What's going on here? He said, well, do you know that there was segregation in World War I and World War II? I said, you know, I'm a poor kid from the Bronx. We moved here, my parents are immigrants, when I was about 16. And I have 16 years of great education, and no one ever taught me that. I said, you're telling me this is racism? Well, they don't like to call it that in the military. I said, well, if you want me to get involved in you, we got to think straight and talk straight. That's who I am. We're going to call it what it is. It's racism, which means that people who were qualified were subjectively determined not to qualify for our nation's highest award. It's not easy to get a Medal of Honor. But when you have 1,550,000 Americans of color and several hundred were recommended and not one gets it, come on, there's something wrong there. And I said, you know what, we're going to work on this together. So I immediately reached out. You need a strategy for everything. I went to the head of the Black Caucus in Congress, Mickey Leland. Now, did I know that Mickey already was thinking of a Medal of Honor for someone in his district in Houston? His name is Seaman Dory Miller, World War II, died in, it was Pearl Harbor. His commanding officer died, and in those days, if you were an African American, Black American, and you were in the Navy, you served in the kitchen. He came out of the kitchen, close to where his commanding officer was mortally wounded, and then died right on the spot, picks up a gun, and shoots down 4 Japanese Zeros. He's got a, I'm using this example, I'll get back to Henry Johnson in a minute, but to show you how crazy this gets, they named a warship after him, they have a stamp after him, Admiral Nimitz weighed in for him, and they refused to give him our country's highest award. He's the next one on my list because in memory of Mickey Leland, guess what? We visit with Secretary of Defense, 1988, and we tell them what we're going to do. We said, we're now going to get 218 signatures in the House, and that means we're going to issue the medals without the military. And I believe the president will do it. We got up to 170, and we get a call from the Secretary of Defense. And we go to his office, me and Mickey, and he says, do you think you're doing the right thing? How do you know that there isn't, or there aren't other African Americans that deserve it more or just as much? I said, well, I hadn't thought of it that way, but what are you suggesting, Mr. Secretary? He said, why don't we pull those signatures and let's think about this calmly. And why don't you let me give a grant to a black university, they picked Shore University, to study those African Americans who received our second highest award and find out why they didn't get the first. Well, that to me sounded pretty logical. And I said, well, how long is that going to take? Well, it'll take a couple of years. Well, it took 8 years. And by that time, I was out of Congress, and they thought they had gotten rid of me. But they didn't know that I was writing articles, I was visiting people, I was on TV shows. You're talking about this ridiculous injustice, this big stain on America. It's bad enough we had slavery in America, but when you think about 1,550,000 African Americans risking their lives and not one gets our nation's highest award, that was enough to get me going. So what happened was they then found that it should have been World War I, World War II, Navy and Army. Somehow they dumbed it down to just World War II, and you may know, it's in the book, that President Clinton presented 7 more medals in 1997. A year before that, I got very close to your dad. He came to visit me many times, even when I wasn't a congressman. He was so frustrated by this that he didn't think anything was going to happen except that we found one by accident, by the way. The first one, Corporal Freddie Stowers, South Carolina, 1991. I get a call from the White House. They said in the course of this study that was started in 1989, we found a file that didn't have the night on it. No one acted on it. And as president, I want to issue the medal. Can you come here in 2 weeks? I said, yes, I can. So the first was George H.W. Bush in April of 1991, first Medal of Honor. But it was kind of an accident. They found a file. Then 7 more. And now, after all the work, now how did this happen? It happened because when we ended up with an African-American president, and I knew Chuck Schumer very well. My wife, Shirley, Shirley, stand up. We're human rights activists. There are a lot of Albanians here, I see. And we saved the Albanian people from genocide in Kosovo. What happened in Srebrenica was going to happen there. But what I'm saying is we needed to understand the environment that existed at that time. And I then said, once we had an African-American president, let me go to my good friend Chuck Schumer, who works very closely with me and Shirley on that, and say to him, you've got power. You are a senior senator in New York. You have now the power to do something if you go to Barack Obama. He said, well, can't do that. We got to make the case. So I gave him my files, and for 8 years, his staff worked on it and came up with 2 volumes, about 3 or 4 inches thick, and that was submitted in 2011. It took another 4 years for them to decide that a case was finally made and we're going to do it. And that's how we got Sergeant Henry Johnson. Well, who's Henry Johnson? Well, he's a guy that was so brave, and his unit was so brave, that France, in those days, if you had a segregated division, they didn't serve under white generals. They were sent to France to fight in Europe, and they were serving under French generals. Well, they served so well that his entire unit, that part of the 369th that they gave a parade to, and you'll see the picture in my little book on the inside of the front cover, on Fifth Avenue, they were given by France France's highest award. It's called the Cross of War, Croix de Guerre. But Sergeant Johnson was so brave, they put a palm leaf on his. That means that's extraordinary bravery, beyond the call of duty. Figuring he's going to get this Fifth Avenue parade, he might then, since he was recommended for the Congressional Medal of Honor, along with others in his unit, he couldn't get it because of segregation and racism. But what did he do? He saved his unit. He was so alert, he heard the bushes rustling, and there was a German platoon marching on his unit, and most of these men were asleep. And one was injured already, his friend Needham. He went out alone with a gun and intimidated 16 Germans. He killed 4 of them. They shot him multiple times. His gun was misplaced in the battle. He had a bolo knife, and he went after them with the knife. And the eyewitnesses said, you didn't see anything like Henry Johnson. He was like a wildcat. He just knew what to do, and he was going to do it even if he died. He saved his buddy, Needham, who gave the account. You need an eyewitness, and it still didn't work back then. But we're doing today, Mayor, what should have been done in 1918 and 1919. The thing that really got me going for Henry Johnson was that he died homeless and penniless on the streets of Washington, D.C., looking for a pension during the Depression. Would you believe that? And they didn't know who he was, and when he died, they buried him in Potter's Field. It took some action before me to get him out and put him in, even before he got the medal, to bury him in Arlington Cemetery. And then they gave him the Purple Heart. And they thought that was all they were going to do, until I discovered Dr. Ramsey, and he inspired me. And when I'm inspired, I get on fire. That's the way my parents raised me. That if there's injustice anywhere, as Martin Luther King said, then we need to change it. With that, I just want to say how happy I am to be here with my friends and family, and you, Mayor. You took the challenge, and thank you so much for your compassion and for praising a Republican today.
All right, now, we had talked earlier about the two recent Medal of Honor recipients who received them in, I shouldn't say posthumously, but on June 2nd of this year. And it's hard to believe it took over 100 years for them to get those medals. If you read their citations, which we put on the tables, you'll have to agree that they really deserve the award. Again, they wouldn't have gotten it without the determination, I guess you could say, of a handful of people who continued to fight, even after they were gone, but to fight for what they justly deserve. And we're very fortunate tonight to have one of those people who fought the fight with us. He's a former congressman, United States congressman, and was instrumental in getting the medal for Private Johnson. So I would like to ask former Congressman Joe DioGuardi, escorted by Pete, to please come forward and give us a little background on what was done.
Now, I became a congressman in January 1985. I won the election in November of 1984. Everybody was very surprised because I was in a district that no Republican ever ran in and no Republican ever served in until parties don't mean that much to me, so I don't want to say that except for one thing. I ended up in a district that gave me the most African Americans, black Americans, of any Republican in America. Mount Vernon, New Rochelle, Yonkers. In those days, they were all in Westhcester. Now they're in a congressional district, a lot of it in the Bronx. They changed those lines. Now, why is that important? 1986, Dr. Ramsey visits me. You'll see his picture right here. And by the way, I have a foundation, Truth in Government, and I raised the money from my friends, and this is a temporary plaque. We just had this dedication in Mount Vernon with the mayor of Mount Vernon. Why? Because this expert, he was an historian, Dr. Ramsey, came into my office and said, Joe, I didn't vote for you, but you're my congressman. And he told me a story that was so unbelievable, and it went like this. He says, Joe, did you know that in World War I and World War II, 1,550,000 African Americans, black Americans, served our country. And not one got our country's highest military honor, although a couple of hundred were recommended. I said, Dr. Ramsey, Leroy, I'm a CPA. Those numbers don't add up. What's going on here? In my mind, I was thinking of racism. But then he said, did you know, Joe, that there was segregation in World War I and World War II? I says, no, I'm a poor kid from the Bronx. We moved to Westhcester when I was 15. I got a pretty good education, and no one ever told me we had segregation in those wars. I said, Leroy, you're telling me this is racism. Well, we don't like to call it that. I said, if you want me to get involved in this, I'm going to think straight and talk straight. That's the way I was raised. If it's racism, it's got to be called as such, and I'll join with you and see what we can do. Well, I then went to the head of the Black Congressional Caucus, Mickey Leland, told him about the story, and I said, I'm now going to take this thing on. I know it's not going to be easy, but I got good connections now in the White House because President Reagan didn't know he had 46 elected. I got elected on election day. No poll ever said I would win. And they literally threw a party for me. I was number 46. He thought he had number 45. So I used that kind of connection to call his chief of staff, tell him about this. And they then set up a meeting with me and the Secretary of Defense. Now, take this book home with you, and you'll see what I did over 28 years. The persistence, kicking the door down when the military absolutely refused to reconsider it. And believe me, you'll see me telling the Secretary of Defense, change that decision, or else I'm going to do something no one's ever done. I'm going to get 218 signatures in the House, and I don't need the military. The medal can then be given by the president, and I've been assured that if I did that, the president would do it. When I got to 165 signatures, I got a call from Carlucci, the Secretary of Defense. And he said, you know, you're making a lot of trouble here. They don't want to go back to World War I no black American ever got it in World War I or World War II. I says, yeah, but this is justice. What did Martin Luther King say? You know, justice delayed is justice denied. And again, he said, if there is injustice anywhere, then justice is threatened everywhere. And justice knows no color. If you ever see the statue of justice, blindfolded, right, with a scale, right, whether you're Italian or black or Jewish, when it comes to basic justice, it has to be served in a way that is correct. That's what America stands for. So I decided to make this, and my staff was going crazy. They says, Joe, you're not going to get any votes. You're in a vulnerable district. You're not going to last more than one term. This is not what you should be doing. You're a CPA. Talk about the budget. I said, I'm going to do that too. But I'm going to do this as well, and one of you is going to do the research to make me an expert on this. And that happened. So here it is, 1991. Now, Carlucci, we go to his office, and he said, Joe, you seem to be a reasonable guy. Why do you think that the guy that you picked, Sergeant Henry Johnson, deserves it more than the others that weren't picked? Maybe we should do a study and look at everyone who got the second highest award in World War I and World War II that was a black American to see if there were others who deserved it just as much or maybe more. Now, what am I going to say? I said, that seems reasonable to me. How long is that going to take, Mr. Secretary? Well, that's going to take probably a couple of years. It took 8 years. 8 years. Now, I'm out of Congress, and they thought, because I only served 2 terms, I was in a very tough district. You remember what happened in 1988? Dukakis won New York. He didn't win his own Massachusetts. He won New York, and I lose the way I won by just a couple of thousand votes. In any case, I said, now I'm out. They thought they got rid of me. But this I had now in my blood. And I said, now I started giving speeches, writing articles. You'll see in this book my editorials in the Times, because when they did the study, believe it or not, they found a case, a Corporal Freddie Stowers, you'll see it in the back of this little book that I prepared, where the file didn't have denied on it. In other words, no one took action. That meant that the statute of limitations, 5-year statute, didn't have to be opened. I get a call from the White House, 1991, George H.W. Bush, could you come down? We're going to give the medal to his 2 aunts. We found them in South Carolina. They're 93 and 95. So I went down there, and I have that videotape, and I was kind of honored by the president for doing it. Well, this happened again on June 2nd. I was invited by Obama after this. Now, why did it happen on June 2nd? No one ever thought this could be happening. Well, I kind of pulled a rabbit out of a hat, because 8 years ago, or almost not 6 years ago, when Obama was elected the first time, I said, you know what? Now we got a chance with Henry Johnson. We have an African-American president. So I then went to Senator Schumer, who helped me a lot on everything I do. I said, I've got boxes of files. If you can assign a staff person to this like I did, I think we can come up with a much better case than was made years ago for Henry Johnson and do this. And he says, Joe, I was in the House, and I was one of those 165 signatures. Let's do it. Well, it took him 4 or 5 years to come up with 2 files. I should have brought them this thick, redoing the case, and that was 2011. And just now, 3 weeks, a month ago, I was in the White House, and we got the medal. So that shows persistence. Maybe you got to do that in life with important things. So now, bottom line, I'll give it to you like a CPA. We have 9 medals. The one from 1991, and the one now with Henry Johnson. So that's 2 from World War I, and the study gave us 7 from World War II. So we're up to 9. But I'm not quitting. It's not over. Because there was another guy that I went after back in 1986 to get the head of the Black Caucus, Mickey Leland, to join me. He says, Joe, I have one in my district, Seaman Dory Miller, World War II. They have a battleship named after him. They gave him a stamp. They gave him the 2nd highest award. They refused to give him the Medal of Honor. So the job is not finished. And if you heard his story, you wouldn't believe it. I'm not going to give it to you tonight, but you'll read it. It's in this little book. So with that, I'm pleased to be here, especially my brother. He has done so much for me. I don't think I would have been elected as a congressman if it weren't for my brother and sister. They dropped everything. It became a family enterprise, let me tell you. And look at this picture right here, and that's the last thing I'm going to say. That is the 369th Black Division, New York, in a parade on Fifth Avenue, 1918, when they came back. They all got the Medal of Honor Croix de Guerre in France. They came here, were refused everything, and Henry Johnson, the one that we saved, it brought tears to my eyes. 10 years later, they found him homeless, penniless. He died on the streets of Washington looking for a pension. So now we gave him his reward. Hey, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Joe.